Welcome. This is the Patten Free Library's first year doing the Camden Conference, and we are very excited. Before we get started with tonight's talk, I'm going to turn it over to Pam Berry, who's joining us on Zoom. Pam is a member of the Camden Conference Southern Maine Committee.
Good evening. My name is Pam Berry, and I am very happy to welcome you on behalf of the Camden Conference. I think you're going to find, I know you're going to find this program tonight very, very interesting and very credible in terms of the latest events with the balloon. I would like to thank the Patten Library in Bath for their participation and for the work they do on this. And I look forward and hope we'll be able to work together for a number of years. On February 17th through the 19th, we will present our 36th annual Camden Conference. The title of the conference this year is Global Trade and Politics, Managing Turbulence. Information on the purchase of tickets is available on our website, camdenconference.org. And you'll also find on that website the roster of presenters who are going to be at the conference. And I'm sure you'll be impressed with the number of presenters involved and the international makeup of the presenters. You will also find on that website a list of all of the community events we've had during the year and there are a few left that are going to happen before the conference. The mission of the Camden Conference is to foster discussion on world issues. In keeping with this mission, we do a series of community events around Maine, and we have in the southern Maine area, we have 10 libraries involved. So we've had a lot of presentations this year, and we've had a fairly good attendance at them. Zoom has helped that in some ways, that people, particularly since we do a lot of our events in January, February, and the weather is always a concern. So we have more and more people involved in the events through Zoom. And the purpose of the events, again, is to support the mission of the Camden Conference and to get people locally and in the community involved in the different issues related to the conference. I hope that you'll find a way to attend the conference. I have been doing this for a number of years, and every year I'm surprised and so pleased with the level of participation, the discussion at the conferences, and just to be able to have the kind of discourse that we wouldn't ordinarily have. I'd also like to say that we have more than 70 high school students from around Maine who will be attending the conference. So again, thank you for being here, and thank you to the library for their support.
Thank you, Pam, for making sure we are involved and on track this year. And before we get started, I'm just going to introduce our speaker tonight. John Doughty is currently the Chief Investment Officer for R.M. Davis, a registered investment advisor with $7 billion of assets under management located in Portland, Maine. John leads the firm's research effort and is chair of the investment committee and is responsible for the firm's investment strategy. John specializes in energy, economics, markets, and geopolitics, and presents regularly on global economic and market trends to business partners and others in the community. And how long did you say you've been involved with the Camden Conference?
Over 10 years.
Over 10 years. And if you are joining us on Zoom, we are about to screen share John's entire presentation, so you can open that up on your screen. And if you have any questions on Zoom, you can pop them in the Q&A part, and I will relay them to John as when the time comes. All right, it's all yours.
Great, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're going to speak about space. I think it's a pretty appropriate time, particularly given what's going on now with the Chinese spy balloon. It kind of shows us that you don't need to have space-based assets in order to be a national security threat to the United States or our allies. I think it's also appropriate that we're in Bath tonight. After college, I worked for 3 years at Bath Analytics in a management training program. Bath Iron Works is a national security asset, believe it or not. It fits right into national security. It is one of 2 shipyards in the United States which build our largest and the world's most sophisticated naval surface combatants. So when we speak about national security, it's 300 yards down the road.
Yeah.
But tonight we're going to speak about space. Elon Musk is a bit of a, you love him or you hate him. I would argue that he's a national treasure in many respects. And he's really pushing the United States efforts in space. This is an artist rendering of the SpaceX Starship, which when built will be the largest and most powerful rocket that's ever left the planet.
Is he making that one?
Yeah. Yeah. When we think about space, I think, we'll just briefly talk about some of the visionaries of this country. Robert Goddard was really the father of modern rocketry. He created the first liquid fueled rocket. And then we had our famous science fiction writers, which I think really kind of, got the intellectual juices of a generation going, and folks wanting to explore space and various planets, the moon, and hopefully Mars someday. And then John F. Kennedy, who challenged the nation after the Soviets really would gain first mover advantage in space with the Sputnik satellite, and then by putting a human in space. And now I would argue Elon Musk is really the most important person on planet Earth in terms of space. Undoubtedly. Going back to the first space race, after World War II, the United States and the Russians gained a lot of space knowledge from the Germans with the German V2 rocket program. So we took a number of scientists from Germany, and the Russians did as well. But it was really the Russians that struck first in terms of putting a satellite in space that would orbit the Earth. Followed up in 1957 by putting a human in space. And so this took the United States security apparatus by surprise. It was a shock. We were in a Cold War with the Soviet Union at the time, and this was a major threat to the United States primacy on the global scale. Shortly before this happened in 1958, Dwight Eisenhower formed NASA, which would be our primary intellectual and physical powerhouse in order to run our space program. But I think it was in 1962, now this was done in several speeches by President Kennedy. This picture here is from Rice University, but really he put out a national challenge for the nation to challenge the Soviets in space. Put a vehicle in space, put a human in space, and eventually put humans on the moon. So that process was done in 3 major sections. Right here is the first segment of this was Project Mercury. This was really getting a spacecraft in space to orbit the Earth. And then to run various interactions and tests of whether or not humans, how we would get humans in space. Following this was Project Gemini. So this is where we put a human in space. And if you think about it at the time, space is the perfect vacuum. So this spacesuit was tested obviously by someone for the first time. And so there was a large learning curve for the United States to actually do all this, get a spacecraft in space, get a human in space, recover that human back on Earth safely. So this was Project Gemini. And then finally, Project Apollo was where we would have several successful landings on the moon, one that was aborted. And arguably, after doing so in 1969, the first space race really came to an end. At this point, the Soviets could no longer challenge United States dominance in space. They didn't have the economy to do it, or the technology to do it at that point. But the United States and the Soviet Union actually did find some détente in space. So in 1975, you had the coupling of the Apollo-Soyuz spacecraft in orbit. This was, a great achievement in many respects. The two nations were really at odds from a geopolitical standpoint, but from a scientific standpoint, this was again some, peaceful action that took a lot of scientists working together because these two spacecraft utilize different technologies. So coupling them together, like there are different oxygen and nitrogen levels in each spacecraft. So it actually took scientists coming together and working hand in hand to try to figure out, okay, how are we going to do this? So we did have this détente moment in space, which I think is important. This is an image of the inside the space shuttle. So if you look at this, there's 1,000 buttons or switches in the space shuttle. The next photo is the SpaceX Dragon vehicle, and it's pretty much all touch screens. And you can really just, if you juxtapose these two 1,000 buttons and switches versus that, technology's come a long way. It really has. And I think that comes down to processing power. So in 1970, in order to land the Apollo module on the moon, we had the computers that would run 85,000 instructions per second. Now, the latest iPhone processes about 16 trillion instructions per second. So the bottom point here is that the computers used in the 1960s and early 70s would require 2.2 days to do the same amount that an iPhone can do today in 1 second. So that's incredibly important. It means that the computer hardware that was in the early space vehicles was big and it was heavy. And that's critical because getting things into space is very, very costly, getting them past the gravitational pull. Let's see what we got here. So here we've got this SpaceX Dragon vehicle on the right and a 787 Dreamliner from Boeing. The SpaceX rocket weighs about as much as 2 of these aircraft, but produces the thrust of 12 of those aircraft. So the thrust from that spacecraft is just immense. It is a very, very powerful rocket. We're going to talk a little bit about satellites because space is big bucks. There's a lot of money headed towards space. A lot of the money spent in space is in satellites. So just briefly here, the various orbits where most of these satellites exist. Primarily, most satellites are in low Earth orbit, which is up to 2,000 kilometers from the surface of the Earth. From 2,000 to 20,000 kilometers, you reach medium Earth orbit. And then there's other orbits as well. Geosynchronous is where much of the communications hardware is in space, global positioning and things like that. And the number of satellites has surged in the past several years. Much of this is due to SpaceX. They're putting a lot of satellites in space to make a global communications network. Now, getting these satellites in space historically was really driven by the Europeans with Ariane Space. This was formed in 1980, and it was really the first commercial launch service. The United States formed the United Launch Alliance to kind of compete with this European endeavor in 2006. So quite a ways down the road. Lockheed Martin and Boeing are the primary contractors in that, and that was really to get U.S. satellites in space. Today, much of that is done by SpaceX. So a private company created by Elon Musk is putting some of the most sophisticated U.S. Satellites in space now, and humans. But in terms of satellites, there are many different types, commercial, military. If you think about using your GPS in your automobile, those are relying on satellites. satellite radio, military communications, all sorts of military applications, all accomplished with the satellites. And if we look at the distribution of satellites, again, most are in low Earth orbit. So 86% of active satellites approximately are in low Earth orbit. So that means they're, up to 2,000 kilometers. And then you have fewer further up. Satellites by country, the United States operates about 62% of active satellites, followed by China. Satellites by purpose, most are communications, and the 21% are Earth observation satellites. And by end user, most of these are commercial. Now government is 12% and 10% military. And this is important because more and more data is being created every day. So I have an Apple Watch. So if I move around, it's tracking me. Well, that's creating data. And that data is just growing at a tremendous rate. And it's being saved in the cloud. And this data is big bucks. All sorts of retailers use it. Certainly the military uses it. We use it for global positioning. We use it, in your automobile in terms of tire pressure monitoring. I mean, there's just data flowing around us that we don't even realize. And that's really driving this, many of these new satellites in space. And satellites also are being utilized in the fight against climate change. So satellites have the ability to look in and do thermal imaging of the rainforest. They can certainly do high-level imaging of forest fires in California and the West to help to aid firefighters in the fight against these fires. They can be utilized to monitor the glaciers in Antarctic or in the northern climate. So satellites are really just utilized across the board. But I think now we've really entered this space, what I'll call it the space 2.0. It's the second space race, and it's a new space renaissance. You can see some of it here in terms of the number of rocket launches that really started to just climb significantly from where we used to be. And I think there are several reasons for this. Launch costs have come down. Much of this has been driven by SpaceX. You do have more and more vertical integration. So SpaceX is not only building its rocket, it's building its engine, it's building a lot of the components that go into its rocket, which have kept costs down. So then they're not reaching out to Boeing or Lockheed Martin or Northrop Grumman for various parts of their rockets. They're just building them in-house, which is, they've proven cheaper. Satellite costs have come down. Again, if you think of the components in a satellite now, you just think of the components in your iPhone. There's a lot of processing power in here, and it's small, it's compact. Our semiconductors, certainly the president has outlined the importance of semiconductors to the United States in this kind of economic race with China. So semiconductors are more powerful, they're smaller, they're lighter. All of this is certainly benefiting the space race. We have a number of new entrants in the space race, SpaceX being the most important, but you also have Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, among others. There's even a space company in Brunswick, Maine, at the former Brunswick Naval Air Station that does small rocketry, but nonetheless, potentially putting small satellites into space. So space is really moving forward. And I think it's really come down to this rocket. This is the SpaceX Falcon 9, and I do have a demonstration. My wife introduced me to the wonder of Etsy. So this is from England. I don't know if everybody can see it, but you can certainly see it. So this is the Falcon 9 rocket. And the key here is when this rocket takes off, eventually gets it to a certain altitude, This stage continues to go towards space. This stage normally would just fall to Earth and just be lost. But what SpaceX has done and what Elon Musk has done, and I know folks criticize him for Twitter and they criticize him for tweeting, but he is a genius, okay? This rocket is falling towards Earth and it has a number of systems that can actually land it on this barge that you see here. This is an autonomous drone barge in the ocean. They can also land this on solid ground as well. They can land 2 to 3 of these at a time, which they've demonstrated. What does that do when you can land that much of the spacecraft? It can save you 30, 40, $50 million per launch. So doing so, he's game changed the entire space race. Certainly there are a number of components that go into this. It has landing gear. It has thrusters that can be turned on and off, which is interesting. The thrusters on the bottom can move, a number of other systems, but that has really been a game changer in the space race. So what does that mean in terms of dollars and cents? In order to put a kilogram into space, it would cost the space shuttle $65,000. 1 kilogram is 2.2 pounds. I probably put that on at Christmas time, but I digress. So Elon Musk can do it for $1,400. That is a competitive advantage. If we need to put a spy satellite into space, it costs the United States less than it costs the Chinese at this point. We'll talk a lot about the Chinese because I think that the spy balloon is starting to really show the American public what's been going on for quite some time, and it's been discussed in the national security circles. It was discussed when I used to work at Bath Iron Works in the 1980s. China is a competitor to the United States. Now, in terms of putting a human into space, again, the Apollo program cost $390 million to put 1 astronaut in space. Elon Musk does it for $55 million. That is why SpaceX now is a primary contractor for NASA. So when NASA needs to put folks up on the International Space Station, they contract SpaceX, and SpaceX takes those astronauts to the space station. I think the other important thing is rocket engines are now built in this country. Certainly, we're hearing a lot. We heard about it last night in terms of infrastructure programs. Bringing chip production back to this country, bringing manufacturing back to this country. We brought the construction of rocket engines back to this country. There was a period where the United States was relying on these rocket engines from Russia in some of its launch vehicles. That is no longer the case. Now we do have rocket engines from SpaceX and Blue Origin as well. So this is an important, really kind of a national security asset to have. So SpaceX through its Starlink network, and this is an image of one of Elon Musk's spaceships. And these are all satellites that are going to be deployed into orbit. So Starlink really is going to be this global network whereby if you live in Uganda, conceivably, you will have access to the internet. If you're in the Sahara Desert, you will have access to the internet. Where has this been utilized recently? In Ukraine. So Musk did turn satellites over to the Ukrainian military to use in the fight against Russia. There's also tourism in space. So certainly Blue Origin and some other companies are really focused on space tourism. It's a dangerous endeavor. We'll see how it pans out. But there's also the fact that you will eventually be able to manufacture products and mine asteroids in space. This becomes very important when we start to talk about Musk's vision of landing humans on Mars. Being able to put spacecraft in space and mine various bodies in space for oxygen, water, and other elements that would be needed for that endeavor. And manufacturing various, so manufacturing things in it. So space is very cold, and it's a vacuum. So those properties are actually beneficial in the construction of certain things. Perfect ball bearings, if you can imagine. So if you create a ball bearing on Earth, given our gravitational pull, it is not perfect. As spherical as it looks, it's not perfect. In space, you arguably can create a perfect or near perfect ball bearing, which means no friction. So wear and tear, say on an automobile or anything that turns like an aircraft engine would arguably be non-existent. So space can unlock some of these things for us. Let's see what we got here. So when we look at space now, I think it is certainly becoming more congested. So lower costs are meaning that more and more countries are putting satellites and spacecraft in space. It has certainly become more competitive, particularly between the United States, China, and Russia is still a key player, and certainly contested from a national security perspective. There are 77 approximately civil space agencies around the world, but the four primary are NASA, the European Space Agency, the Chinese National Space Agency, and the Russian Space Agency. And there are certainly four global navigation satellite systems, GPS in the United States, Galileo in the European Union, China has their own, and GLONASS in Russia. But as we're learning quickly, China is learning very, very rapidly and catching up to the United States primacy in space. Arguably, they lead the United States in certain technologies, in various camera technologies and other technologies that surveillance technologies here. And the quality of their research is certainly improving. So this is probably, I think point number 2 is a very frightening statistic that Chinese research, historically, the Chinese would just put tons of research out, almost like throwing things up against a wall. And the research was hit or miss, it was kind of junky. Now, they're accounting for more and more of the cited research. So if I write a research, if I'm a PhD student at MIT and I write a paper and it's published and peer reviewed, that's point 1. Point 2 is scientists around the world see my paper and actually start citing it, as you know, John said here, the blah blah blah. That gives it credence. It gives it scientific weight. Well, now China leads in that. So they're actually putting out scientifically important research. That should be setting off alarm signals in Washington, D.C. Science and innovation are really what will drive the economy. Now, right now, we lead in terms of our semiconductor and intellectual property, you know, in that arms race versus China, but, you know, they're certainly catching up in other areas. And we do have this race for space with the Chinese. And as you can see here, so the United States has laid out the Artemis Accords, which is really the near-term view from NASA in terms of what we plan to do as a nation on the moon and eventually on Mars. China has also put out its own view of what's going to happen, and they're planning on putting a base on the moon. The United States and our European partners have the International Space Station. China's building their own space station, and it should be fully operational quite soon. We've certainly put a number of rovers on Mars. That third picture down, China has as well. And their launch cadence is starting to catch up to the United States. So they are becoming, you know, a very, very significant challenge to the United States in space. And this runs the gamut. Here we have just a comparison of some space telescopes. The next major space telescope the United States will put up will go up in 2027, but China will be putting up one in 2023. So we're just starting to see the pace of their acceleration in space is just rising rapidly. The United States military certainly viewed space as an important domain, but you can see the budget for space this year is about 22 billion. Historically, it's been around 7 billion. Now, this does not include so-called black programs or programs that are too top secret to really even discuss. So there's obviously some things that are going on in space that aren't reflected here, but nonetheless, the things that are reflected here are pretty significant. And space is a critical domain. So if you look at the 5 domains of warfare, we've got land, sea, air, space, and cyberspace. So this is kind of this multi-centric warfare of the future. With space and cyberspace being really 2 critical domains, where the United States is being challenged significantly out of it. And I think a lot of this led to the creation of Space Force to really create its own combatant command, given the importance of space. And while this was not fully embraced when President Trump outlined it, I think most folks in the national security realm at this point think it's been a very, very good idea. It's focused the United States military and a specific aspect of the United States military on space. Space is the ultimate high ground, and in warfare, high ground is a force multiplier in the battle.
Was he the first one to come?
I think he will. Joe?
No.
No.
His predecessor.
Obama.
Huh?
No,
I'm thinking of the one who's in now.
Oscar.
Biden.
Biden.
Was he the first one to really think about this stuff up to date, and or were they much more cooperative and interchanging in parts and procedures and so forth? I had a sense that in the last couple of years that competition, maybe it's just the competition they didn't want people to see, was going much faster. Just trying to get a handle on how it was functioning.
You mean with China or with the Space Force?
Okay, good.
Well, I think if we look at space in the 1990s, so Gulf War I was the first military conflict where space actually was on the battlefield. Prior to that, space hadn't really entered the military realm in terms of combat and violence. Gulf War I, you had GPS utilized on the battlefield. You had missile warning systems, satellite communications on the battlefield, unified combatant command of various land, sea, and air forces on the battlefield. So space really earned its, battlefield decorations, I think, in Gulf War I. Collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. By 1993, China formed its version of NASA, the Chinese National Space Agency. So that was in 93. By the year 2003, so roughly 10 years later, they put their first astronaut in space. So that was a real rapid period. Now, arguably, China does something very well, and is, stealing technology. So this is, widely known stuff, but how did China move so quickly? They're absorbing United States and Western technology. And that's helping this rapid pace. Now, there are a number of threats to these space-based assets. So you can bring down satellites with missiles. You can attack their communication networks on Earth. You can attack them with directed energy weapons, electronic warfare, so you can jam them, cyber warfare, orbital or space-based weapons. You can even control another satellite to ram another satellite. So satellites are actually very, very vulnerable. The United States is planning on putting in orbital outposts, and this is a pure military test bed that would be in orbit. It would be uncrewed. But China really has upped the ante in terms of its counter space capabilities. So the United States isn't the only country that can take out another satellite. I think Russia and China have demonstrated their capabilities as well. And if you think about how much our economy is reliant on these satellites, just from a global positioning system, communications, from those two standpoints alone, taking out critical US space-based assets could really render us or our economy in some dire straits for some time. And just to my point earlier, certainly China has acquired a lot of foreign space and counter space technologies covertly. We're seeing this with the balloon. I think the American public is finally understanding that when a Chinese corporation or a Chinese shell corporation comes to Iowa or comes to Montana and says, oh, I want to buy that farm, and the farm's located right next to a US military base, the answer should be no. That's what China's doing. They, it's referred to in the South China Sea as salami slicing. They slowly take and take and take, and acquire physical property. But this is from Jane's Defense, which is a world-renowned research firm in London. China has been slowly buying companies with technological and space-based prowess as well. So the United States wouldn't allow China to come in and buy, say, Boeing, for example. But there are smaller companies that, the United States and our Western partners have to really start waking up that if we allow these transactions to go through, those technologies will be used by the People's Liberation Army. We have, let's see, the space economy is, 400 billion roughly today in terms of what's going on in space. A few years ago, it was 366 billion. It's estimated by 2030 that the space economy will be worth $1 trillion. So it's big bucks. And this kind of breaks out what that space economy looks like. Much of it is in satellites and various different kinds of satellites, and then eventually exploration vehicles. So a lot of the money that's being spent in space is on satellites. Northrop Grumman is one of the United States leaders in satellites, Lockheed Martin, making very, very sophisticated spy and sensing satellites. And again, these satellites, and this is from US military, but our satellites are being attacked on a daily basis. So you've heard the story that certainly all companies in the United States are having cyber attacks launched at them every day, right? Satellites are too. Satellites are being attacked on a daily basis. These are what we call reversible attacks, though. So there is not a kinetic attack on a US-based satellite, but what China and to a lesser extent Russia are doing is they're probing our satellites. They're hitting them with beams and other things to show that they can do it. And China has demonstrated the capability to take out a satellite in space with a missile. Now, the United States, this timeline walks through. The United States did it first in 1985. China, Russia, and India have all demonstrated this capability. So this is a pretty significant capability. The problem is the byproduct of this is a lot of space junk. Because every time a satellite is blown up in space, that debris really kind of stays in the debris field for quite some time. And it's traveling at thousands of miles per hour. So it puts at risk other space-based assets in space. And we have this picture here, but you know, space is in some respects becoming Earth's trash can. There's a lot of debris in space at this point. 27,000 pieces roughly of space of debris are being tracked by what's called the Department of Defense's Defense Space Surveillance Network. But if you look at pieces larger than 1 millimeter to 1 centimeter, there's over 130 million of these pieces out there. And they're traveling at roughly 17,500 miles per hour. So even if a speck of paint is traveling at 17,000 miles an hour and hits me, it'll go right through me, right? But it can cause damage to satellites and spacecraft. So that's why, you know, the regulation of space is very, very critical. And having kind of a common set of ground rules in space is important for major nations. Because if we don't, you get what you call the Kessler effect. And that's simply, here's an image of just thousands of satellites in space. If this satellite crashes into this one crashes into this one crashes into this one, breaks into 3 pieces and crashes into 3, you get this continuous destruction of space assets. And that would just be a tremendously negative thing to happen. Now, Russia, the United States, and China have demonstrated the capability of tracking satellites in terms of other satellites in space can actually be maneuvered and follow another country's satellite. In fact, the Russians have what's almost like their little nesting dolls. They have satellites where a satellite will come out of this satellite and another satellite will come out of that satellite. And they can maneuver them and track US satellites. Now, doing so puts US satellites at risk because they could ram their satellite into ours. This is from the National Air and Space Intelligence Center, and it just shows some various ways that you can use a satellite to combat another satellite. Using radio frequency jammers, just ramming another satellite, lasers, chemical weapons, microwaves. So satellite warfare and counter space is a very, very serious topic that certainly the 3 major countries are looking at. Now, the United States has developed, Northrop Grumman has developed what's called a mission extension vehicle. So this is a satellite that will actually connect to another satellite in orbit. So let's say we have a very, very important satellite in orbit. It still has a usable life, but it's running out of energy. This is really kind of referred to as a space tow truck. It can connect to that satellite. It can move its orbit. It can provide an alternative power source so that you can actually extend the life of an existing satellite. Now, put on your CIA hat for a minute. It also means that I could use this mission extension vehicle to rip apart a Russian satellite or a Chinese satellite. So that's where we are. Now, looking at NASA and the peaceful use of space for a moment. NASA has roughly a $25 billion budget. This is the James Webb Telescope. You've probably all seen images in the New York Times or the Washington Post or on TV. It's just showing some brilliant images of deep, deep space and the earliest creation of the universe. That's one major program that NASA has done a fantastic job with. But this Artemis program, which is NASA's big program now, and that's to put humans back on the moon and eventually to put humans on Mars. So that's really what the Space Administration has laid out. This is a public-private partnership. SpaceX will be part of this process as well, which I'll show in a moment. This is the funding of the federal budget. So if we look at NASA's share of the federal budget, you can see back in the 1960s and early 70s, it really eclipsed right around 4.5%, peaked right there. So 4.5% of the total federal budget was going to NASA. Money equals success, and it took a lot of money to put humans on the moon, and that has dwindled over the past, certainly several decades now, just given the competing priorities of the federal budget. So NASA really has to rely on not only itself and its core competencies, but also on the private sector. So this is where certainly companies like SpaceX and others are just critically important in order to help the United States continue to move forward in space. And NASA does have its challenges. I mean, arguably, it's part of the government, it's a bureaucracy. It's facing changing administrations. So you might move from one administration where the president is very, very supportive of space and the exploration of space. But the next administration may cut the budget and say, we have another priority in space. It's gonna get its budget cut by 10 or 15%. The problem is these space programs are just long-lived assets, and they take a lot of time, they take a lot of investment, sometimes decades. So for an administration to come in every 4 years and to change the amount of money that's being flowed into the administration or its priorities certainly can hamstring it. Congress certainly is part of the problem here. There is parochial funding. You'll have one state that has a space economy, another state that has space economy, and funds will flow generally to both. Generally won't make a lot of economic sense, but from a congressional standpoint, it does. NASA arguably has some bloat. It's a bloated bureaucracy. There's an unwillingness in some respects to take risks in the government. If you fail, you're gone. Your career's ended. That's one of the wonderful things about SpaceX. Musk has instilled this, failure is okay. They've launched a lot of rockets and they've blown up at the launch pad, but they learned from every single one of those. By learning immediately from their mistakes, they're able to gain success quicker than say NASA can. Because NASA really kind of operates with this zero failure mentality. SpaceX, on the other hand, they're throwing things up in the air quite a bit and it's blowing up, and it's part of the process. And I think that ethos, really, you have to give credit to Elon Musk, because he's really just pushing the paradigm. Now, this Artemis program. So this rocket took off late last year, circled the moon, and came back, and its uncrewed crew capsule landed safely in the ocean. So that was step one. The final step will eventually be putting humans on the moon here. So this is the portion of the rocket that will actually head towards the moon. The crew will be in the crew capsule in here. Once this gets to lunar orbit, it will meet up with this spacecraft. So this is a SpaceX Starship. So these will meet, above the moon's surface. So this and this will connect. The humans will go from this to this, and then this will land vertically on the moon. I mean, it will be. There's a lot of math and science that goes into this stuff, and to land this spacecraft vertically on the moon, it's fraught with a lot of risk. Clearly, I think. It is a big spacecraft. It's not like the lunar module that was fairly short and squatty and really wide. And if you landed at an angle, you're okay. So there's a lot that has to go right with this. This will be a very, very important moment for the United States from a national, I think for our national pride and psyche, to get this right. If we get this right, there's a lot to thump on our chests about. This will be a very, very important moment, I think. And then after that, the next step will be Mars. Why? Because it's there. Elon Musk will say why, because, you know, eventually the Earth's gonna have its run, and it's time to explore another potential planet that could, where humans could inhabit. And Artemis and NASA will be part of that as well. Now, just briefly on the geopolitics of space, you know, having some primacy in space is important. This is an artist rendering of a space-based laser that can be used as a weapon. You've probably heard about hypersonic missiles in the press. You know, China and Russia arguably have a slight lead on the United States now with hypersonic missiles. So these are missiles that travel at 5 times the speed of sound or greater. So they travel so quickly, they're harder to detect and harder to take down. Now, the United States isn't asleep at the switch here. For many years now, most of the public don't really know this, but this Boeing spacecraft has been flying around the Earth. I think it's done this several times. It's been in orbit for over 300 and some odd days. And this is a potential vehicle to launch weapons with in space and do other things with. So we're kind of doing things in space as well. I would note that something to think about with the space balloon, with the balloon that the Chinese were using is the US military has made the point that not only can you get some better sensing technologies of military bases from these balloons, they could be used to bring over nuclear weapons and to drop a nuclear weapon in the atmosphere in order to create an electromagnetic pulse strike. So there's, you know, certainly things to be concerned about. And I think it's important for the United States to really kind of put its foot down and stop this stuff from happening. But I think that's all I have.
Great. Any questions from any of you here or anyone on Zoom?
Have there been any reports on the balloon? The public?
So the military is recovering the balloon. And we may find out something about, you know, what its contents were, but I'm hoping that the US military won't tell us. We as a public know a lot. I'll go on a diatribe for a minute, but if US special forces are used to go after a high value target, we should not know as a country, as a public, that it was the United States Navy SEALs out of Florida or something like that that actually did that. There could be an acknowledgement that it happened. I don't think we need to know what is found in this Chinese satellite. I think it's important for the United States military and Congress to know, but it should be on a need to know basis, I think. But from everything I've read, it does appear that the Chinese have been doing this now for several years, not only against the United States, but against our allies, flying over Latin America. I think there were 5 continents that they've done this over.
Yeah. I was just. I've been reading a couple of things and it sounded to me like we were starting to get along and pull Z words and maybe start talking to them.
Right.
And then this, and it was really disappointing.
Yeah. It was, I think you're exactly right, I think,
Could have been worse.
right. I think it took a lot of people by surprise, because Biden had his meeting with him. And we were sending the Secretary of State over there,
Yeah.
and then this happened, so,
They're stinky.
yeah. And it does, you know, raise the concern that, we'll end on a very sad note, how about that? So if you look at this, will the United States and China go to war? So, Graham Allison, from Harvard, wrote Destined for War. You know, can the United States and China avoid this Thucydides trap, where you have one leading power and one growing power? And historically, you know, red's bad here, red's war. Statistically, if we look at this, we're destined for war. Now, that's not to say we can't avoid it. I certainly don't want war with China. Nobody wants war with China. I think we want to peacefully coexist as economic competitors, I think, as many folks say. But, you know, the balloon raises the risk factor, I would argue. I mean, we have US aircraft flying through the South China Sea, naval warships going through the South China Sea. Who's to say now that China won't get even closer with their aircraft to one of our aircraft and potentially knock it down or shoot it down? I mean, it's. And you're seeing jockeying in the Pacific. So I think it's very troubling that the Solomon Islands now have allowed the Chinese to base some of their, you know, to have a port with the Solomon Islands. That's not good. Australia doesn't like it. The United States doesn't like it. So we're starting, we've opened a new Marine Corps base in Guam. I mean, this is starting to heat up. You can see ourselves walking into war, I think, in some respects. Which I think is sad. I mean, you know, this is 2023. I think we should have learned by now. And I'm not just saying the United States.
Who's sort of in charge of keeping an eye on the Chinese buying that farm next to the base, our base in Montana, or, you know, back when we had a naval air station here, or?
Yeah, I mean, the US government is supposed to. I can't remember the name. There's a name of the organization that kind of looks at that kind of stuff, but I mean, it's hard, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, our fellow Americans are capitalists. Yeah, I know. And arguably they'll do it through shell corporations. So there'll be like a Chinese shell corporation based out of like Canada. So you'll see it's got a Canadian name, but it's actually, if you follow the logic, it's owned by the Chinese. And but it's a challenge.
Yeah. You said you were gonna end on, and you did.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for coming and talking to us about space and China and war and everything else. That was fascinating.